you could not have picked a better day to be here. We're so excited that you're here today. If you're here for the first time or as a guest or maybe the second or even the third time, we just want to extend a very warm welcome to you. We hope you feel right at home. You know, one of the easiest ways to learn about Rivers United Church is to go to our website, which is riversunited.church. You can also connect with us. You can connect with us in person. Maybe you want to connect with us with a card. We have a connection card that's in the pocket behind the seat. If you have a question, a comment, a prayer request, fill out that connection card and drop it in those boxes at the doorway here. And one other thing I wanted to mention today, if you are a medical professional, you're a person that's qualified or certified in CPR or first aid, we are looking for some people who are in the medical field that want to be on our medical team. If that's something that you're interested in doing, just write medical team on the connection card. Keith Richard will get back with you. If you're interested in serving in that capacity, we'd love to hear from you. Just write medical team on the connection card. Also today, if you came here preparing to give to Rivers United, we want to thank you so much for your generosity. There are many ways to give. You can give online, which is easy enough. You can also text to give. You can also use the giving envelope that is right next to the connection card there behind the seat, and you can fill that out, drop it in the connection boxes on your way out as well. A couple other things I wanted to tell you about. There's a lot happening in our church in the coming months, really. A lot of activities, a lot of events. One of the ways you can learn and keep in the loop is by signing up for our digital weekly. It's an email that comes to you, keeping you abreast of all that's happening. And real quickly, there's a few things I'm going to highlight today. First of all, our youth in the second service, right after worship, they're going to be meeting in our newly remodeled cafe. If you haven't been back there, you need to go back there. It looks great. And we're going to do that the second service today after the worship. So they'll be meeting back there. Also, tomorrow night, we are going to have a winter skate night at Smithfield Skate from 6 to 8. We'd love to see a lot of people come out, all ages. You don't even have to have any money unless you want to buy a snack. That's all you need. Another thing, if you're a lady in our church, on February 2nd, we're going to be starting a women's group. In your weekly today, there is a little QR code. And if you take your camera on your phone, you can register for the women's group right there. Also, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this in the future, but Married Life Live is coming up February 24th, and registration is already open for that as well. I think I've got everything. Sorry, I had so many things to talk about today. I had to bring notes. Once again, welcome to Rivers United. We are so glad that you are here today.
I think I am. Are we good? Not sure why that. There we go. All right. So I had to laugh when he's mentioned that we have Keith Richards that you have to talk to. Not the Keith Richards, but the Keith Richards we have here. So just in case you thought we actually had him, it would be interesting to have him at our church. But anyway, that would be kind of cool. Okay, so today we are wrapping up a series called Days of Elijah, where we have been taking a look at an ancient prophet in the Bible who we found didn't start off as an extraordinary man. He started off as an ordinary man who God used in an extraordinary way. In fact, he came from a backwoods area. There was nothing necessarily astounding about him other than his commitment to God and to help a nation who had literally turned away from the true God, and he stood up to a king who had led the children of Israel into idolatry. And so we saw with this man that God used him because he was willing to stand for the truth. And so we looked at several things, from the miracles that God allowed him to do, from saying, hey, because you haven't followed God, it's not going to rain, to a moment where he stood up in front of everybody and called down fire from heaven so they would know that there was a true God in heaven. And then we talked about, even personally in his life, how that God helped him overcome a voice that was holding him back. That he thought it was the voice of the evil queen who threatened his life, but that God used a voice to overcome a voice, that the voice of God overcame it. And today, we have one final message That's really amazing, all the things that we covered, and if you missed any of that, you can go back and listen to it. But what we have is one last message from the life of Elijah. What I believe is probably, and you guys have told me how much this series has impacted you. Many of you have come, and I so much appreciate it. And I know as I've been studying for it, God has been using it in my life as well. But I got to tell you, today's message is the most important part for our church. I believe the principle we're going to talk about today will make us or break us. And it has to do with the word that was sent to Elijah. That after his time of depression and he actually heard what God had to say, God told him to go back and to anoint a new king. That would take care of the king problem, right? There's going to be a new king. But he also said this, go back and anoint Elisha as your successor, the new prophet. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. That there is no Elijah that is irreplaceable, and there is no Elisha that's self-appointed. That God has a plan for us to be able to pass the mantle of leadership and be able to help people do it. But here's what I believe we have to know, and this is what we want to talk about in the final message. Characteristics that God looks for in a leader. And I want you to think about it in two ways. One is this, is about yourself personally. We're going to take a look at some qualities that God looks for when he selects a leader. We're going to talk about, hey, do you have these qualities? If you don't, then, no, I'm just playing. There's no hope for you. No. What we want to do is this. We don't want you to feel guilty. We don't want to feel like, hey, here's a list of things that you're not good at or you're not doing or maybe you never even knew. But to say, hey, here's some qualities we need to work on instilling. Here's some qualities that the church could help equip you. The church could help develop you. So important that we do that. And then the second part is this. If you are a leader, maybe take this as a list of going, here's the qualities you need to look for in other leaders to develop them. And the people that are following or the people that you're leading, help instill these qualities in them. So we're going to get into it. 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 19. After Elijah had been in a cave and after he had heard from the Lord and God gave him the word, it says, so Elijah went from there and he found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen and he himself was driving the 12 pair. Elijah went to him and he threw his cloak around him. So I want to kind of pause here just for a second to say this. Elisha had no idea this was about to happen, okay? Elisha was busy doing something. He had no clue that Elijah was coming this day. He had never thought about himself as being a prophet. And it seems like all of a sudden, out of the blue, this prophet shows up and just throws his cloak, which a cloak, I like Star Wars, so I watch Darth Vader quite a bit. He has a cape, so same type thing, right? It's like a cape, cloak, mantle is another word for it, coat. But it represents something. It represents an anointing. It represents the passing. So he's basically saying, you are going to be my successor. And he just went up to this random guy in the field that God told him to go to. Now, I got to tell you something. To us and to him, it seemed very random. But it wasn't random. I need you to think about why God picked him. He was busy doing something else. You see, he had 12 yoke of oxen, which meant his family was probably pretty rich. I mean, like they were pretty successful in what they did. Now, they weren't rich enough that they didn't work. But he had been working for a while. He had a big plow. He was plowing the field. He was faithful doing it and working in the inheritance that he would have received. That in their country, they passed it down from one person to the next, and you kind of did whatever your parents did. And so it was kind of expected of you that that's what you would do as well. And he was good at it. But the part I want to tell you today is this: is if you're not faithful in what's in front of you, you'll never be faithful in what's ahead of you. That God uses you where you are. You see, some people think, hey, if I ever have that position, then suddenly I'm going to rise to the occasion, and that's simply not true. By the way, we know that, even the survivalist people know that, right? That you don't rise to the level of the moment, you rise to the level of your training. You rise to the level of your preparedness. And that this man had been prepared, and he was faithful in what was in front of him. And you know who saw that? God. So whatever you're doing, I need to let you know something. God is watching. That Elisha's name was mentioned. This guy that was just farming God mentioned in the cave, way far away from him, to Elijah, the great prophet of God. Elijah didn't know who he was. He just said, go and do this thing. And what I want you to see today is this. In fact, I want you to write this verse down, Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, that Jesus teaches this. He says, be faithful, those that are faithful in the small things, I'll make you master over many things. If you want a great leadership principle for yourself, if you're not faithful in the small things, you won't be faithful in the big things. If you're a person that's trying to select leaders, trust me, as a church planter, and I had to evaluate many, many leaders, and I made many, many mistakes, and I've made mistakes in it in my life too, that if a person's not faithful in the small, they won't be faithful in the big. Sometimes people think they're going to rise up, or, hey, that person's really gifted, but it won't do away with their faithfulness. God is watching, and that's what he sees. The other part I want you to see is this, is that when Elijah came and threw his mantle over him, when he threw the cloak over him, it changed Elisha's life. You see, he had never seen the vision of God, and in that moment, all of a sudden, everything that he had been working for, all the expectations that he had of life changed with a new vision that God gave him. I could be a prophet. You see, up till then, he was happy being who that person, who his parents expected him to be, who everybody else expected him to be. And you will never be successful as long as you don't have the courage to step out in faith to be what God is calling you to be. That some of you, the reason why you are where you are is because other people have expectations of what you should be and what you should do and what you should have. And I believe that God's doing the same for you. It's a mantle. It's a vision of the future that God has. By the way, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's exactly what happened to him. In fact, here's what happens next. After, so he's out there plowing, puts the cloak around him, and then it says this, Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, he said, and then I will come with you. This next part I don't think I've ever really talked about. I don't know that I actually ever saw it until I started studying it this time, and I think I've probably left it out before, but here's the part I want you to see, and it was because it was a little confusing. It says, go back, Elijah replied. What have I done to you? That seems a little bit messed up, right? I mean, like, he comes there, he kind of puts this thing on you that basically says, hey, you're going to be the new prophet, and then Elijah was just planning on leaving. But Elisha ran after him and said, hey, I'm going to come with you. And he's like, no, I didn't have any intention of you coming with me. I'm just here to anoint you. In fact, that's all God told Elijah. He never had any intention of saying, this guy's actually going to come with me. Interesting, right? God doesn't always give you all the details, even for the lead. Did you know that? He gives you as you go. He said, go anoint him, and then the story is going to progress. It goes on to say this. So Elisha left him and went back, and he took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plow equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he set out to follow Elijah and become his servant. He killed his oxen. You know how long it takes to raise oxen in those days? I mean, it's like saying, hey, man, you just burned all your stuff, and then you made a meal out of it. You served it to everybody. There's no turning back now. This is where the Bible is going to kind of differ from some of the self-help stuff you're going to study. Maybe some of the leader stuff that you studied. There's no turning back at this point. I want you to see this, though. This is a principle that I think maybe you even need to write down. That God gives a vision, and then he gives you the details as you go. And I know some of us are going to struggle with that. Those of you that are real controlling, anybody, raise your hand. No. If you know somebody, could you raise their hand, just grab it? No, I'm just playing. Right? See, I got to know everything before I get started. And that's where some of you guys are at. And can I tell you something? Well, how's it going to be? And what's it going to be? And how are we going to do this thing? You see, you're busy questioning. You spent years questioning what God, hey, I got this question, and I got to ask this question, and I got to ask this question instead of obeying God's command. You're never going to be the person that God's calling you to be. That's a fact. That's how it worked. God gives you the calling. And if you read the Bible, then you're going to see this over and over. And I could go through a bunch of stories for you if you wanted, of people that God called and then he resourced them as they go. You see, that's how it works. He doesn't say, hey, here's all the resources, and then you go. He says, here's the calling. Now start walking. Start being faithful in what I've called you to be. If you need a verse for that, Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, maybe write it down. The just shall live by faith. Faith means you got to step out in faith. And the thing that he did that I want you to see is the first characteristic that I want you to write down, and that's this, is that he sacrificed. He sacrificed. In order to answer the call, you have to leave where you are. You have to leave the comfort of what you know and the expectation of the people. Can you imagine what people thought when he did that? But here's what I know. You can't move into your destiny as long as you're holding on to your history. That's a fact. And that takes sacrifice. You see, when you know the will of God, you gotta stop having a backup plan. I know that's going to rub you wrong, but it's a fact. You have to be all in. The warning, though, for somebody is this, is that you got to make sure, is it God calling you? You see, do you have the affirmation of other leaders? I know a lot of self-appointed people, but realize Elisha didn't self-appoint. A man of God came and affirmed him. And as a pastor, that's why it's really important that we're ordained and we have people that affirm the gifting in us. But once it has been affirmed, once you know that's your true calling, are you holding on to the past? You know, he burned his plows. So let me ask you a question. What ox do you need to burn? What ox do you need to kill? What plows do you need to burn? What are you holding on to? Because here's the reason why some of us aren't getting into the call that God has for us, because we still have a backup plan. Or another way of putting it is, some of those things are positive, like in his life, hey, there was nothing wrong with him having an inheritance. There was nothing wrong with him having that. But he knew, hey, if I have this, then I won't be able to do it. But how many of us, some of the things aren't good? How many of you have a stash you need to burn? You know what I'm talking about? You got a secret place that you keep some stuff just in case, right? Just in case I got to turn back to the old lifestyle. You see, I've decided to follow Jesus, but just in case, I kind of still kept this. You're never going to be the man or woman of God that you could be. That's not the characteristic that God looks for. You know, some of us, we've kept some things, right? If you're struggling with eating, then you know what that's like. If you really want to lose weight, can I tell you how it works? You got to get rid of that stash. You got a box of candy that sits over there, and you think you'll never go to it, but in the right moment, you will, right? Some of us got some numbers in our phones that we said, we'll never call that person again, but we hang on to the number, right? You got a dealer that you know. You see, is that too real? You got a thing that you say, I'm not going to do that anymore, yet you're kind of holding on with one foot in and one foot out. But if you want to be the true man of God, if you want to know what the characteristic is this, you got to be all in, and that requires sacrifice. You got to give up to go up. And this guy knew it. You know why he could go to Elijah? Because Elijah said, dude, I didn't come here for you to follow me. But Elisha knew, I need to be with the man of God, and he knew God was calling him to do it, and he said, hey, here's how it's going to be. You're worried about what I got to go back to. I burned it all up. There's nothing to go back to. What do you need to burn? What do you need to kill? That's a good question. The first quality is this, sacrifice. Now, we're going to fast forward a little bit. We're going to fast forward 6 years. Okay, to 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 3. And I got to tell you, in the Bible, it seems like, and this is what happens a lot in the Bible, where it only seems like, a couple chapters, and it really is. And so we don't know a lot about what all occurred. There's some things you can read about, and you can go back and read it. Maybe you're reading in your quiet time with us, and you can read about it. But 6 years he spends serving Elijah. And I want to kind of pick up there and just read this verse for you. It says, the company of prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? And he said, yes, I know, Elisha replied. So be quiet. He doesn't want to talk about it. The time has come for Elijah to leave. God has a plan, and we're going to get to that in a minute. It's pretty amazing what happens to Elijah. But Elijah's last thing was this, is that, hey, Elijah, you're going to go and you're going to anoint your successor, and then your life is going to be done. You're going to pass the mantle. I don't think he realized that passing the mantle meant 6 years. That's a while, isn't it? 6 years is a while. But he spent 6 years. The other part I want you to see is this, the word master. Can you circle that? I know that's not a popular word today, and I'm not trying to, I want to be clear about what this is, because honestly, this passage of Scripture has been abused in the past that basically means, hey, if you're the big leader, then other people are so subservient to you. If you have a certain position, then other people are, that you look down on them and you treat them. And I've even seen that in churches, and there's like all these titles that go on and this kind of palaver kind of stuff. And I got to tell you, it's a real turnoff, and it's been abused in the past, and it's really a horrible thing. And that's not what we're talking about at all. We got whole messages to describe that. We're not talking about that. But what we are talking about is this, is that Elisha served him. And can I tell you another quality that we need to see? Service. If you want to know if somebody should lead, the true essence of leadership starts with service. How's your service? How well do you do serving other people? If you can't serve, you really can't lead. It's a quality that God looks for. If you don't know that, then if you say you're a follower of Jesus, then you need to go back and read what Jesus had to say about it. John chapter 13 is a great place to look. Before going to the cross, in fact, we talked about it a few weeks ago, that before going to the cross, that Jesus took time with his disciples to wash their feet. And they were kind of astounded by that. Now, people washed feet in those days because they wore flip-flops and they were in the desert. But they had a servant do that, not the master. But he said, if I, your Lord and Master, have done this, then you too should serve other people. That's how you can know who's a true follower of Jesus, is that we serve. And what God looks for is somebody that's willing to serve. But that's not always easy, is it? You see, because when Elisha was in the field, he was a leader in the field. He was the head man in the field. You see, he went from being a boss of bulls to being a servant of a prophet. At times so critical, though. Are you willing to humble yourself? It's so important. Are you willing to humble yourself? Are you willing to do the things? And I got to tell you, these are qualities to look for as you look for potential leaders, but it's also qualities to look for in your own life, because I think some of us are missing the blessing of God because we think it's about title and position, that if I have this title and position, I shouldn't have to do these little things. If you're an entrepreneur, you started anything, then you know there's a lot of jobs you've had to do, right, to get to where you are. And you might have people to do it sometimes, but if they quit, you still get to do those things again, right? But can I tell you, God uses that in bigger ways than you might imagine? I know for me, and it's a part of the history of this church, that we started a church 13 years ago. Hard to believe it's been that long. We were looking back at pictures of a leadership thing we had, and it was like 9 years ago. It popped up on Facebook. And it's a piece of this church. And I know we merged, but our part of it's a part of this church too. And it's part of your history too, whether you were part of it or not or whatever. But at the beginning, we had a building that was in Windsor that was just a warehouse space. And we were used to, because we came from a bigger church that had a building, and before that, they had met in spaces. And so we thought, hey, when we plant a church, it's easy. You just go out and find a space and rent it and whatever. And then you come out here to the country, and you're like, what building is that? I remember talking to a consultant, and he said, well, you need to go to downtown Windsor and look at some of those spaces that you could rent. And I was like, clearly, you've never been here, right? I mean, like, there is no downtown Windsor. What are you talking about, right? So we found a space, and it was great. It was a warehouse space, but it was incomplete, and we had a date to start the church, and we said, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to start with it being incomplete and finish it as we go. No, we learned a lot of lessons about that. Don't want to do that again. No, I'm just playing. The train, the train's right next to it, and so in the first service we had to leave the door open because we didn't have like the emergency doors, and they said we won't give you occupancy unless you leave the door open. So we left the door open, and we had to stop the service 5 times for the train because it's so loud you couldn't literally not hear it, right? But can I tell you something about the spot though? The thing that I want to tell you about is while it was undone, eventually it became a great building, and it's still being utilized by another church, and it's pretty awesome, and we love the guy that rented the building to us. But I got to tell you something about that. I thought to myself, who's going to come? We have porta potties. Who's going to come? We have doors. We have a whole church that's broken and unfinished. But I look back this past week, a family was remembering a guy that had died recently, or he had died a few years ago. And this man struggled his whole life. His kids went to Western Branch Community Church, and they're about my age, and so he was a little bit older. But he struggled with alcoholism. He struggled with drug abuse. He'd never entered the doors of a church. But he came when we started New Branch. He did. And I remember him sitting there, and he would stay after to help with some of the construction thing. And this guy that was so broken, that building related to him because that building was about as broken as he was. I don't think, had that building not been broken, he would have ever come to church. I don't think he would have ever gave his life to Jesus, and I don't think we would have been out at Davis Lake Campground and baptized him had it not been in that building. Can I tell you something today? Be faithful in the small things. Be faithful serving in the small areas that seem so insignificant to you, but yet God might use it in an incredible way, and you're missing it because you think that God can't use small things, but oftentimes the thing that God is using is the small areas of faithfulness. And if you don't get that, you'll never truly be blessed by God. It's a characteristic you got to look for. Serving. Zechariah 4:10, if you want to write it down, it says, don't despise the days of small things. Don't despise the days of small things. By the way, it goes for the mentor too. You see, I have a feeling he's thinking, this guy? I've been a prophet my whole life. I'm the greatest prophet Israel has ever seen. And this guy? But yet the seeds that he planted, you see, seed's a small thing, isn't it? But he planted seeds for 6 years and watered those seeds and spent time with this guy and invested in this guy. And we'll tell you at the end how that paid off. Can I tell you how it pays off? Beyond you. Are you just building your kingdom? Or are you building God's? You're building your kingdom, you're going to do everything that's for your glory, for your brand, for who you are in your lifetime. But what God did in the life of Elijah was bigger than the miracles you had seen before, and that's including raising the dead, by the way. But what he did here was bigger because it went way beyond Elijah. Okay. I think you're starting to see. It goes on to say this, then Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, as you live, I will not leave you. So he went to Jericho. So the Lord had told Elijah, I want you to go to a certain place, and then it's going to be the end of you. We don't know how that's going to be, but basically he's getting pretty good with just going, whatever God says to do, I just kind of do it, and I know this is going to be the end. And so he starts to go towards Jericho. Now, I just want to mention about the route just for a second, and then I'll move past it. I just think it's ironic. And it's not just irony, it's actually a plan. He's taking the reverse route of how the children of Israel came into the promised land. The first place they came to was Jericho. And then you're going to see next, he's going to the Jordan. So just wanted to show you that. Okay. Things pastors find interesting. Verse 5. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? And he said, yes, I know, he replied, so be quiet. Okay, that's kind of funny. All right, verse 6. Then Elijah said to him, stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, as you live, I will not leave you. So the two of them walked on. I will not leave you. That's an amazing quality. You know, he stayed with that man right by his side for 6 years. He served him for 6 years, and now it's at the end. You know, it goes by, like when you look at it at the beginning, you're thinking 6 years. But at the end, you're thinking, really, now? I'm not ready. You know, that's what he's saying. 6 years. You know what number 6 means in the Bible? It means the number of man. 6 years, on the 6th day, God created man. He took 6 years to develop Elisha. 6 years. To develop this characteristic. You know what it is? Stability. You want to know a great quality of a leader? You want to know the quality that God looks for in a leader? It's stability. In fact, in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you want to write it down, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, this is in the New King James Version. It says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. How can you lead if you're not stable? How can you lead if you're not faithful? If you don't stick it out? Because here's what I know. Skill will never make up for instability. That's a fact. Leaders in the room, managers in the room, can I help you with something? Take it from a church planner that made a lot of mistakes. Don't think skill will make up for it, because here's what you're going to do. You're going to have the most gifted people around you, and then when you need them most, they won't be there. Let me ask you, are you there? Are you just very skilled and gifted? You know, I had somebody challenge me with that. I'd like to just talk about you guys. It's much easier for me to. But I remember, well, it's been a long time ago, 20 some years ago. I was between jobs, and I was going to get another job, and I was interviewing with somebody, and the guy said, I really like you. I can see you're a really good salesperson, and you really sell yourself, John. But as I'm looking at your resume, I notice you've been to a lot of places. And you know what I think about you? I think this about you. I think you're really good at selling yourself, but I'm not so sure you'll stick around. I didn't like that he said that, but it was right. It changed my life. Because it told me something. I kept thinking, why do I do that? Because when things get tough, you go to the next place. When things get tough, you go to the next place. When things get tough, you go to the next place. And you know what God's looking for? Stability. You know what it's telling me? You got to get out of your feelings. You got to do the tough stuff even when you don't feel like it. You see, some of us, we bounce from church to church. Oh, is that too close to home? We bounce from church to church. There's nothing wrong with leaving a church to go to another one because of vision, but there is something wrong when you go, well, I was hurt. And I understand some of that. But you know, it hurts. Can you worship God even when it hurts? Can you worship God even when it's difficult? Even when you have a hard time? Can you stick it out? Can you be there? He never left the man. I don't think it was easy. Will you stick it out? Will you be stable? You know, our precedence for that is this, is Jesus despised the cross. It actually says it in the Word of God. He still went there, though. See? Will you? Stability is one of the most important qualities that you will ever understand. Okay. He goes on to say this, verse 7. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stood at the Jordan. And Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water with it, and the water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed on dry ground. Can I just pause here and say, wow? I mean, that is a bad dude, right? I mean, do you know that when the children of Israel came in, there was 2 times that God parted water for the children of Israel. The first time was when the Egyptians were chasing them in at the Red Sea. Maybe you know that story, where Moses stretched out his staff and the sea parted and they went over on dry ground. But when they came to the promised land, they didn't go over the first time, and then they marched around the wilderness, and you can read this in Exodus. And then when they came back, God said, hey, we're going to cross the Jordan. And he told them to go into the water, and they had to all get in, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant inside the water to the Jordan. This is how they're going into the Promised Land. And the Jordan River parted, and they walked over on dry ground. Then they took the stones, and they made them so they'd never forget what God did. And they're standing at the same spot where those stones are, and Elijah doesn't, he doesn't have, it looks like just another day in the life of Elijah. He takes his cloak off and smacks the ground, and the Jordan River parts. That's some faith there, isn't it? Okay. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" And he said, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." I want a double portion of your spirit. The final characteristic that I want to show you today is this. This is the most important one. Spirit. I want a double portion of your spirit. Let me ask you a question. Do you know what to ask for? If somebody were to ask you today, what is it you want? If the person that's your hero, if the person that's your mentor asked you, what would you ask for? You see, because I believe that this scripture has been misused for a long time, that means you can gab it and grab it and name it and claim it, and that's what you do, and that you covet what somebody else has. And so what Elisha really did was abide his time so he could get Elijah's stuff. And he said, I don't want your stuff, I want your spirit. You see the difference? What you really need is the Spirit of God. That goes beyond Elijah, and Elijah knows it because of what he says next. Elijah says this. He says, you have asked a difficult thing. You have asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I am taken, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not. See, what Elijah recognized was this, is I can't give you that. But that's what you need most. You see, you don't need what somebody else can give you. You need the Spirit of God. And that's what will go beyond. Verse 11, as they were walking along, talking together, suddenly, if you could circle that, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. I mean, I hate to keep saying this, but can we just say wow again? I mean, like, dude. I mean, he just parted the Jordan River. That was cool. And now, the way that God chooses to take him, you see, it was funny, if you go back to last week's message, and I just want to add this because anybody was here, if you go back and listen to it, the thing that Elijah was so worried about last week was dying. And so he was so scared of death that he wanted to kill himself, okay? Don't ask me about the logic there, but I know we've all felt that way at times, right? I mean, is that right? Because he didn't like the way he was going to die. And by the way, God never let him die, and I don't want to put anything in the scripture other than to say a fiery chariot came, picked him up, and we don't know where he went, okay? We hear about him other places, he appears other places, we just don't know. But it's the weirdest thing, and we're just going to leave it there, but it's pretty awesome, right? For Elijah. But can I show you about Elisha? Elisha saw this and cried out. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. And then he took hold of the garment and tore it in two. He took hold of his garments and tore it in two. That's a sign of mourning. And then Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him, and he went back and he stood on the bank of the Jordan. You know, it says suddenly. Suddenly. It all of a sudden happened. He's gone. But it really wasn't sudden. They knew it was coming, and he knew from the time that he gave him the mantle, it was 6 years, but 6 years at the end, if you've been there, then you know suddenly, right? And all I got left is his cloak, my father, right? My father. Think about what he's saying. I don't want your mantle, I want the man, right? I don't feel like I can keep going if you're not here. You know what it tells me? Be careful you don't miss while you're coveting a position, that you don't miss the process, because it's brief. It's so brief, the passing of the mantle, and it's so important. There's nothing that Elijah ever did that was more important than passing the baton, passing the mantle to Elisha. But I got to tell you, 6 years seems like a long time until it's gone, and then it's suddenly, right? Oh, I want you back. I want you back. How can I keep going? Am I ready, right? You thought you were ready before, right? Hey, I went from the bulls to the prophet. But I need this process, and now I want him. See, he understood something. You know what he learned here? That's more important than position? Relationship. You know how you build a man of God? It takes a man of God to build a man of God. You know how you build a woman of God? It takes a woman of God to build a woman of God. And those times that we get to spend together to do that are brief, but they're so important. If there's anything this church could learn, that's what we have to understand. I will see him no more. But he picked up the mantle. He didn't get stuck in grief. He grieved, and he picked up the mantle. Don't get stuck in grief. Pick up the mantle. It's okay to grieve and pick up the mantle at the same time. Pick up the mantle. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah, and he struck the water with it. And he said, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Where is the God of Elijah?" You did hear the last part, right? Jah, not Shah. He didn't say, "My God." You know what he's asking? Is this going to work for me? He's gone, and I have the cloak, and I don't know. Can I tell you what God did? God said nothing. He wanted him to discover something. Here's what he wanted him to discover. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. Wow. He didn't say, God didn't say anything because he's saying this. It works if you work it. Huh? It works if you work it. See? God has given us what works. This works. This is what's going to take us. This is what's going to lead our church. And he picked up the mantle. You get it. It works if you work it. Here's my question as we wrap up today. Will you pick up the mantle? Are you stuck? Are you holding on to your past? Or do you want your destiny? You want your security? You want your stash? Or you want your destiny? Pick up the mantle. Can I ask us something else, though? Can we also pass the mantle? I don't know which place you're at. I don't know which place you're at. I wrote down a couple things that I didn't want to forget. That's why I was looking. The results. Because I got a feeling this is what God's challenging us with today. I knew as I read this last passage, I haven't preached this part before because usually you end Elijah on a cool note and you just go, hey, yeah, Elisha changed. But I didn't want to do that because I realized this was the most important part. Elisha left, and the first thing he did was take the cloak, and he struck the water, and it parted, and he walked over on dry ground. And then Elisha went on to do even more miracles than Elijah. Did you know? And so not only one generation was served, but more generations were served. If I went a step further, what I would tell you is, well, let me tell you how cool it was for Elisha. Elisha, he went on to do all kinds of miracles, including he raised somebody from the dead. Who's even heard of anything like that? Only Jesus that we know of did that, but Elijah and Elisha both raised somebody from the dead. But even more so, when they buried Elisha, because he didn't get taken into heaven like Elijah, but even when his bones were in the grave, the people still remembered what they had taught and what the prophets had challenged him and how he was trying to set the past straight. And there was a time where they were fighting, and one of the men got struck and he died. And they took the man and threw him into Elijah's grave. This is long after he died, almost 100 years after Elisha died. And they threw him in the song we sang today, Rattle. That's what it's about. And the dead man came out of the grave after touching Elisha's bones. I would say that the Spirit of God was heavily upon them. Let me ask you a question, church. Are we just building something for one generation? Are you just building our kingdom? Or are we willing to pass this on? will you pick up the mantle? And will you pass on the mantle? And by the way, if you read in the Bible, there's so much about Elijah. It was so hard to end it here. Not only did he invest in Elisha, but it says that when the time of Jesus came, after a 400 span years of silence from God, when all of a sudden Jesus was going to come, you know who came before him was a prophet, and his name was John the Baptist, and he said he had the spirit of Elijah. Will you pick it up? Will you pass it on? Can I pray for us? Let's stand for prayer. Spirit of the living God, we need you today, God. It's the peace that we downplay because it's not about us. It's further than us and it's bigger than us. And it's things that we devalue that we need the most, Lord. But we don't always see it, so God, open the eyes of our heart. When I looked at this list today, Lord, I haven't always valued it. But yet I know it's true. That's the kind of people we need to be, and that's the kind of people we need to develop. We need to develop ourselves and develop other people to be the way that you are, and that's who you empower. And if we were to do it, Lord, there's no reason why in our generation we won't see the same power flow that they saw. You're just looking for a conduit. So God, I pray we surrender to you today. God, I pray for the one that doesn't even know you, that they realize that you died for their sins and you rose from the dead. You're offering them resurrection power today, Lord. The same power that it took to raise Christ from the dead. That's better than the resurrections that they did back then, because those people died again, but you never died. Is available to us, a power that will never run out. I pray somebody will tap into it, but not just the power of it, but the relationship of it. And then, God, I pray for us as a church. I don't pretend to know which place that we're at, whether we need a mentor or whether we need to be a mentor. You can sort that out, Lord, but I do know this. God, we got to put some emphasis on this, because the part that's going to last is us planting the seeds and developing the seeds. Us maybe leaving a spot of leadership to become what you're really calling us to be. So I think there's somebody, Lord, that's right where they are. They're scared to move forward because that means they have to move away from what they know. But Lord, they can't have their destiny while they're holding on to their history, while they're holding on to their security. Lord, I pray, let them pass it on. Then, God, I do pray for those of us that you're raising up to raise up others. Help us not to just focus on self, but to get so far beyond it. Because, Lord, honestly, those 6 years in the life of Elijah, they weren't easy years, Lord. They were difficult, and helping somebody doesn't know, and the challenges, and we know how painful it is working with people, but, Lord, it is the lasting legacy that we will always leave, so let us invest in it. And I believe we'll look back on it and go, you know, the greatest years of our lives were spent being faithful to the small thing that's going to change not only us, but the generations to come. God, make us those kind of people. Make us that kind of church, and we'll give you all the honor and glory and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, if you need prayer, we'll be here after the service. For everybody else, God bless you. Have a great week.